Hello, Adult Sunday School Leader. This week we're going to be in a book I don't believe I've ever taught from, or maybe even never heard a sermon from, I don't believe. In fact, I think the only time I hear the name of this book is maybe when the kids are singing that Books of the Bible song. We're in the last lesson of the unit that's called Putting Fear in Its Place. The lesson it's number 6 in the series. It's called Joy in Place of Fear, out of Zephaniah chapter 3, verses 9 through 20. And the point of the lesson is fear will be a thing of the past in God's eternal kingdom. Now, those in your class who use a Bible app will have no problem finding this book. Now, for those who use a physical Bible, you might tell them that it's the 4th book from the back of the Old Testament. So if they find Matthew, then you go backwards: Malachi, Zechariah, Haggai, Zephaniah. So now I'm going to admit up front here that for me this is a tough lesson to prepare for. It's not an easy lesson, and I'm not suggesting that you shy away from teaching difficult lessons, but for those of you who find it too difficult to teach as you read through this, and your church didn't have Sunday school on either Christmas Day and or on New Year's Day, you might consider going back and picking up on one of those 2 lessons that you missed in the last week or 2. Well, let's first talk a little bit about the man and then about the book that he wrote. So in chapter 1, verse 1, Zephaniah traced his lineage back 4 generations to Hezekiah, his great-great-grandfather. Now, scholars believe that this was King Hezekiah, and if that's the case, then Zephaniah is the only prophet that came from royal descent. The name Zephaniah means Yahweh hides, or Yahweh has hidden. Now that's all we know about this prophet. That's all we know. Now the book is one of 12 minor prophets, and remember that major and minor prophets, it's an adjective. Major and minor, that's an adjective that describes the length of the book, not the importance of the message. And this book is only 3 chapters in length, probably takes up 2 to 3 pages in your physical Bible. If there were a key term for the book, it would have to be Day of the Lord, which is referred to 23 times in this book's 3 chapters. The exact phrase Day of the Lord is only used 6 times, but other terms are used to refer to that same time period, including that day, that same day, day of the Lord's wrath, the day of the Lord's anger. And so as you can tell from these descriptions, this day is not going to be a pleasant time. It will be a time of wrath and judgment. And that's what chapters 1 through chapter 3, verse 8 deals with. Judgment on the whole earth, on Judah, on the nations surrounding Judah, and on Jerusalem. It's going to be a fearsome time. But that's not the end of the story. Because in chapter 3, verse 9, the beginning verse for our lesson this week, the theme moves from judgment in the day of the Lord to salvation and deliverance in the day of the Lord. And as we look at that first section of Scripture for the week, in Zephaniah chapter 3, verses 9 through 13, let's keep in mind about God's promise to Abraham back in Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 through 3, that the whole world would be blessed through him, through Abraham and his descendants. Well, it was the job of Jewish people to be God's missionaries, to proclaim the Lord to the Gentiles, but what did they do instead? They followed in the ways of the surrounding nations and began worshiping other idols. So instead of them influencing the nations influenced them. And even in the temple, there was this court of the Gentiles where the Gentile people could go in and talk to Jews about God and pray to God, but instead it was turned into a market and an area for money changing. Now our text this week immediately follows the description of how those nations are going to be judged. Then starting in verse 9, the mood of the passage changes as God states how he's going to forgive and he's going to bless. It says he will purify the lips of the peoples. They will no longer call on false gods, but they're going to worship only the Lord. And they will serve the Lord, as it says, shoulder to shoulder, meaning they're going to serve God as one. They're going to be in unity with one purpose. Now, Kush was an area in South Egypt, and God said that from beyond that area, which at that time that was the outer regions of the known world then, people would come to worship God and bring him offerings. This means that Gentiles would be part of those who were going to be blessed and were going to worship him. It wasn't just reserved for the Jews. Now, those who would survive that wrath of the day of the Lord, some characteristics of them is that they would be humble, they'd be meek, truthful, and trust in God. And then there's that last sentence in verse 13. They will eat and lie down, and no one will make them afraid. This past Sunday, January 1st, our pastor was out, so I preached a sermon entitled Comfort for the New Year out of Psalm 23. When I read Zephaniah 3:13, I immediately thought of Psalm 23:2, which says, "He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside the still waters. He refreshes my soul." Did you know that sheep will not lie down if they're scared? God, our good shepherd, he loves, he guides, he protects his flock, us. And when we are the sheep of his pasture, as Psalm 100 verse 3 says, we have nothing to fear. Now, yes, we may be going through some rocky, barren, even dark valley of the shadow of death times, but ultimately God will guide us to that eternal rest, that peaceful green pasture where fear will no longer exist. Now, most of us have seen pictures of the celebrations that took place on VJ Day in Times Square back when World War II was over. There were celebrations, there was singing, dancing, shouting, all those things. And that's the picture I get when I read verses 14 through 17, our next set of scripture verses. God's people were to sing for joy, to shout loudly, to be glad and to celebrate. Not just because the day of wrath was over, even though that, of course, would be enough to celebrate, but that the Lord was among them. He was with them. He was rejoicing with them, even, it says, singing over them. Now, of all the things I think of God doing, singing is probably one thing I think of the least. But I don't guess I should. Jesus sang a hymn with his disciples. He most likely sang in the synagogue. In Ephesians chapter 5, verses 18 and 19, we see that one of the characteristics of being filled with the Spirit is to sing and make music from your heart to the Lord. As a mother lovingly sings to comfort her infant child, I can imagine God sings over his people to comfort them, and to express his joy and love to them. Now in Matthew chapter 19, verse 30, and in chapter 20, verse 16, Jesus stated that the first will be last and the last will be first. Now keep that in mind as we look at the last set of verses, 18 through 20, in Zephaniah chapter 3. Those who were last in the eyes of the world, the lame, the outcast, disgraced throughout the earth, and I'm assuming here that disgraced because that they were God followers, they were going to be elevated to a position of receiving praise and fame. So getting back to what we've talked about in previous lessons, those who follow God, even though they may have a rough time during their life on earth, that sadness will turn to, ultimately will turn to joy and celebration. So let's encourage our classes to remember that, just like 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 17 says, "For our light and momentary troubles are achieving for us an eternal glory that outweighs them all." Next week, we're going to be in a special focus lesson called Valued by God out of Psalm 139. Hope you guys have a great lesson this week. And don't forget, pray for and with your class. Thank you guys very much for watching.